Hey, I'm excited to be with you today. So tonight we're going to be in Zoom at 7 o'clock and kind of process through this last week and then this overall things we've learned from our Now book. So our Zoom meeting ID is the same as always. It's 858-8046-1078. So that is where we will be tonight at 7. Next week, we will not be starting a new book just yet. We're going to wait 2 weeks. And so next week, we're going to have just an off teaching night. I will teach something just like this, and then we'll meet together in Zoom and hang out. And then the following week, Kaylee Ferguson will be bringing a word on, I believe at this point, it's probably going to be on prayer. She's going to just talk a little bit about what she has learned about prayer this season. It's always good to kind of hear a refresher, hear different people's what they're learning, what they're working through, what God is teaching them. And so that's what we're going to do on the 12th or 13th, whatever day that is. So that is going to be our Wednesday night session. On that night, we will not be doing Zoom that night. I'll make sure that there's a clear description and understanding of what's going to happen. And then we will start back and we will be beginning the Anchor book. The Anchor book. You should have that, and if you don't have that and you would like a copy of it, please ask me and we can make sure that we can get a book to you so you can follow along with us. So we will start with the Anchor stuff. I'll give you the start date and kind of how to anticipate our videos for that week, and then we will be able to discuss that in Zoom. I'm looking forward to this. This is a book more about understanding who God is, and so I think that'll be a beneficial thing just to remember the characteristics and qualities of who God is. So that's kind of the game plan for the next couple weeks. Just want to kind of give you a heads up on that. So this past week we've kind of looked at the motivation to get out and do what God has asked us to do as individuals, but also as a corporate body. And so the Great Commission is always going to be what our main purpose, our main focus is, sharing the good news of Christ and creating not just people that mentally assent to who God is, but live out their lives, discipleship. And so that's what we're going, that's our main purpose. And so that's kind of what we looked at today. There were two things that really stood out to me in this teaching, or in this small group, I guess devotion time would be a better word for it. In the devotions, it stood out to me. The first being that grace is the main motivator to us doing what God has called us to do. So God has extended grace to us, and by obeying what God has said, but by obeying what God has commanded us as individuals and as believers to do, it's not out of obligation. It's not out of just mere duty. It's out of the grace that's been extended. And so somebody does something for you, you want to be there for them because they're good people. And so that is the overflow of what Christ has already done in our lives, is the reason why and how we can do what God has asked us to do as individuals. And the next thing that really stood out to me that I hope you also paid attention to was the importance of using our minds, being able to think through things, both at a practical level, but also at a spiritual level. One thing that I think is one of the most frustrating things with the American Christian church is the lack of desire to engage the mind inside of faith. There's been this divide of you either have faith or you use your mind. But it's important and appropriate to use your mind to understand and process the act of faith, but also the theology behind the Christian faith. And so don't be afraid to use your mind. Think through things. And related to this was also just think through your actions before you do them. Looking back on my younger days, I've always kind of been a overthinker, but that is definitely something that I've inherited and become much more aware of as I've gotten a little bit older. And so there were things that I would do when I was a kid that was like a really dumb decision, but I just did it because I wasn't thinking through it. And so now I'm the opposite. I overthink things too much to where then I'm just at least in action. So I want to encourage you, use your brains, use your brains, use your brains, use your brains. Both practically in your everyday life, but also when it comes to spiritual matters. There's nothing wrong with turning your brain on when it comes to spiritual matters. In fact, I think that you will probably enjoy learning and growing and understanding things in a new way by just processing things. So that's it. That's it on that. Now let's dig into the main teaching, the main section of what we're going to look at tonight, and then we will gather again later this evening. So we're going to be in Matthew chapter 25, verses 14 through 30. We're going to be looking at the parable of the talents. And so oftentimes when Jesus would tell a story, he would tell a story that had like immediate application, but then there was always something behind that application as well. Some of his parables were completely, absolutely confusing to the original audience. They didn't understand what was going on. He was just talking. But people that were listening, that were truly following, that were understanding what Christ was saying, they were like, oh, I hear what he's trying to say. And we see evidence of that even with his disciples. There were times where his disciples were like, yo, Jesus, what were you talking about? And why were you saying it like that? And so this is a story that has a immediate, practical, real-world application, but it also has a spiritual implication as well that is important to understand. So this is the idea of, we're going to talk about talents. So talents, every time I've always thought of talents, I've always thought of like just like some coins, but this is more like a 58 to 80 pound like block of silver. So this is not just a little tiny bit of money that they were given. These people were trusted servants, but this is a big thing. And so when we get to the story, the piece where the guy digs and buries his talent. So it's not just like burying a little tiny coin. He's like digging a pretty sizable hole to put 80 pounds of silver in. So process through that, and then we'll kind of unpack a little bit about what this is saying. So Matthew 25, verses 14 through 30. For it will be like a man going on a journey, who called his servants and entrusted to them his property. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, to another 1, to each according to his ability. Then he went away. He who had received the 5 talents went at once and traded with them, and he made 5 talents more. So also he who had the 2 talents made 2 talents more. But he who had received the 1 talent went and dug in the ground and hid his master's money. Now after a long time the master of those servants came and settled accounts with them. And he who had received the 5 talents came forward, bringing 5 talents more, saying, Master, you delivered to me 5 talents. Here I have made 5 talents more. His master said to him, Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a little, and I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master. And he also, who had the 2 talents, came forward, saying, Master, you delivered to me 2 talents. Here I have made 2 talents more. Enter into the joy of your master. He who also had received the 1 talent came forward, saying, Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow, and gathering where you scattered no seed. So I was afraid, and I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here you have what is yours. But his master answered him, You wicked and slothful servant. You knew that I reap where I have not sown and gather where I scatter no seed. Then you ought to have invested my money with the bankers. And at my coming I should have received what was my own with interest. So take the talent from him and give it to him who has the 10 talents. For to everyone who has will be more given, and he will have an abundance. But from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. And cast the worthless servant into the outer darkness, in that place where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. There's a few things that we see in this. So the talents are literal monetary pieces. That's what the story is talking about. But then Jesus is also talking about spiritual gifts or spiritual blessings, or the task that you have been assigned for what your purpose on earth is. And so when you sacrifice, when you take what God has already given you, and you say, I'm just going to hide this, or I'm going to take this and I'm going to use it unwisely. I'm going to do what I want to do with this gift as opposed to what I'm expected to do with this gift. Then you are the slothful servant. You're the servant that just takes this stuff and hides it. In the text, it says that the servant makes a comment about how hard and basically mean and unfair the master is. And so there's the way that the original Greek text doesn't come across in the English, but the way that the Greek text deals with it is that, hey, it's more of he's an accusation that he's unfair, but it's not really true of the master. The other two people, they do not view the master that way. It's only this guy that views the master this way. So it's a skewed view of who the master is. We have skewed views of who God is. This is why a couple weeks ago we were talking about the importance of obedience. But before you can obey, you have to trust the person you're obeying. If you have a skewed view of who God is, you're not going to really want to do what he asks, or you're going to be fearful of doing what he asks because you have a skewed view of what the outcome will be. I want to encourage you, continue to use this time to develop an appropriate, a biblical, a real understanding of the characteristics of God. That will make a huge difference in the way that you interact with who God is. When you go to a person that's mean or scary, you're very timid, you're very shy. But when you go to someone that is nice and is there, is on your side, on your team, you're going to interact very, very differently. I want to encourage you, begin to understand the true nature of who God is, and not just what you think he is or what you have heard he is. Dig into the text. Understand for yourself who God is. Know who he is so you can trust him. Okay? The next thing that we see here is that these are all servants. Every single one is a servant, but they were all trusted servants. So they were given a sizable amount of money or a sizable amount of profit, and they were trusted. But what happens to the first two is that they are moved from a position of servanthood, a trusted servant, to someone with leadership or authority. And so when you are doing what God has asked you to do, you're going to be placed in different levels of leadership. And it doesn't necessarily have to be an official form of leadership. Just because you're doing what you are supposed to do does not mean you're going to be a pastor or a youth pastor or a full-time missionary. But you're going to be provided opportunities to continue to exercise the gifts that God has given. But there are going to be some of you that you're going to, you based on what you do, determines what you can do in the long run. If I were to walk onto a construction site and start telling people how to do things, I would be removed forcibly from that construction site very quickly because I don't know what I'm doing. Okay? And so that's kind of the same thing though with the spiritual matters. The more you understand who God is, the more you become not an expert, because we never become experts in who God is, but we become more comfortable with listening to God and knowing what God is wanting us to do. So when we're obedient, when we trust, when we obey in the very beginning, then it's easier. It's more natural for us to take on either more responsibility or more opportunity for us to grow in what God has called us to be. And so this is more than just a quick there's a level change, and it's hard to interact with this. So I hope that we can unpack this a little bit more when we're talking, when we're communicating on Zoom, because it's hard to fully unpack this and make sure that it's clear. But there's a leadership change. You don't have to be an official leader to be a leader, and so obedience to God will provide the opportunity for you to move in leadership in different ways. And then you'll be able to exercise the gifts that God has provided in broader contexts. So, and that's pretty much the main gist of this text. It's just the idea of obedience to what we're called to do is what is necessary. And so it's very simple. It's very simple, straightforward. It's what's supposed to happen. But the application of that is still very, very difficult. And so I want to continue to encourage you during this season of of limited activity, now is a time that you will never, hopefully never have anything to have to deal with anything like this ever again. But you will never have an opportunity where you are able to dig in and do some serious work, both mentally to understand who God is, but then also the heart work of setting sins aside and being ready to step up to what God has called you to do. And so that's not just a mental thing, that's also an attitude, a heart thing. And so I want to encourage you, keep pushing forward, keep growing in your relationship with Christ, and keep learning who God is so you can trust him better, so your trust increases and your obedience increases, just like with grace. The more you understand who God is, the more you understand what God has done for you. And then when you understand what God has done for you, your response to him definitely changes. And so instead of this being like grunt work or dirty work, it becomes a joy to do, to act, to operate in the way that God has wired and created you. You are all each individual different people, and God has used those differences not to divide, not to make cliques, not to make separate groups, but to edify, to build up, and bring the body of Christ together to where you're using those gifts inside the church, but then also to where you're using just how you're wired outside the church to demonstrate the wonders of the grace of God. I would encourage you to make sure that you're implementing and utilizing those things. Awesome. Hey, this is it. I hope this made sense, but I really want to spend time in Zoom specifically talking about this idea of a leadership change, because I can tell the way that I'm talking right now, it's not going to come across clearly. So I want to talk through that. So also, I want to encourage you to spend some time rereading this text, processing through this text, and come to Zoom with some good questions, and let's have some fun. Awesome. Thanks, guys. See you later.